Welcome everyone. As you are stepping into Biostat Town Hall, we're just giving people a couple of minutes to join. So I think we can get started. So hi everyone, happy Friday afternoon. And I'm Romar Mukherjee, and most of you know me. And I know that there are some people joining the call who are outside the department because of their interest in this topic, the lecture of today's town hall. So today we have sort of a two-pronged agenda. We have a guest lecture by Professor David Cutler from Emory University on an issue which stirred up a lot of interest in general, but also particularly last year in view of the racial protests that were going on in the country, but also naming and renaming of a lot of awards and buildings named after famous statisticians. For example, as the chair of Committee of Presidents of Statistical Societies, I dealt with a very controversial and also polarized discussion on whether R.A. Fisher's name should be retired from the Fisher Lecture, which happens to be one of the highest honors in our profession. So during that time, at the joint statistical meetings on behalf of COPS, we put together a session discussing the role of eugenics in statistics and population genetics. And Professor Cutler gave a wonderful exposition of the mathematical theory and how geneticists thought about variation across the human genome and how that has changed. So I was very struck by his exposition, and I thought it would be very nice to bring him to campus. So that will be the first part. And then our very own Raghu is going to moderate the question and answer corresponding to Professor Cutler's lecture. And then the next part, the 3:30 to 4, we are going to really, Mike Elliott and Dave Kubaki is going to navigate all of your questions. There are many, many pre-submitted questions about how do we return to classroom? It took us 3 days to figure out how to work from home, but it will take us a long time to figure out how to work from work again. And so we are going to talk about that, and there is some information, but also mostly responding to your questions. And so we plan this to be a very interactive and engaging session. And without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Professor Cutler. Professor Cutler is a theoretical population geneticist, and his webpage says that he's a theoretical population geneticist by training and also by inclination. So he has been involved in very impactful studies and has a strong collaboration with many people in our Center for Statistical Genetics. And his Michigan connection is that he has been an undergraduate student in mathematics in Ann Arbor. So Dave says that he will accept any invitation to Ann Arbor. So thank you so much, Dave, and the floor is yours. Take it away.
Thank you. Probably getting a little too old for it, but some of my fondest memories were staying up all night playing cards and then going to Angelo's first thing in the morning for a very sloppy breakfast. And I will go to my grave cherishing those memories. And every time I come to Ann Arbor, if anyone has a card game going all night, I will surely join it. Whether or not I'm in shape to play all night anymore, this is another question. So yeah, thank you for the introduction, and I would, Ann Arbor's a fabulous place. So the talk today is really, I'm going to sort of do a sort of a geneticist's view of the eugenics movement in sort of, but I'm going to back up and try to give a sort of broader view of the longer view of some of the history here. But I will attempt to the best of my ability to phrase everything in language that is much more common in statistics than in biology. That many of the sort of biological ideas can be easily understood in terms of really sort of statistical words and notation, which is why I think you guys have invited me. So, right. First, we'll just start with the dumbest definition of the word eugenic. It's a fake word. It was probably invented by Francis Galton in the 1860s. It's, you know, one of these sort of faux Greekish words. And its translation is probably something like good growing or good family or good growth in some fashion. And the term came to mean a truly scientific movement let me sort of, so I can see my own screen now. A sort of a scientific movement which advocates the use of practices aimed at improving the genetic composition of the human population. Well, I think genetic probably wasn't a word then. But the notion was it was supposed to be an applied scientific notion of how to make humans better. And you know, at some level, it was both progressive and you know, humanitarian, sort of like idealistic. So the question is, how does one improve human genetic composition with 19th century technology? How can a scientist make a recommendation given what they knew in what they had in the 19th century? You know, nowadays you can imagine that a scientist would take his knowledge of genetic variation and take his knowledge of how genes are transmitted from one generation to another and use that knowledge to try to improve the DNA. You know, modern technologies, we can't even think about doing things like modifying specific nucleotides in DNA in specific individuals and seeing if that can make people better. The 19th century was not such a world. When the eugenics movement came into existence in the sort of 1870s, almost nothing was known about how inheritance worked, about how traits, how genes sort of moved from one generation to another. And almost nothing was known about what genetic variation was and how it was and how it, whether it was a good thing or a bad thing. So when we're going to try to make some sense of the eugenics movement, you know, sort of from a modern scientific, you know, sort of perspective, knowing that the goal was kind of progressive and really sort of about trying to make humans better. But we're going to sort of try to first understand it, you know, sort of more or less a formal Bayesian sense. And we're going to ask, you know, sort of a few different times moving forward in history, what was the prior information known at the time about the nature and extent of human variation? What was known about variation? And then what was the model people had at that time about how variation was transmitted from one generation to the next? And we'll sort of walk through what was known about the prior, what was known about variation, and therefore, given what they thought the prior was and what they thought the model was, what conclusions did they draw about how to make humans better? So what it's going to turn out, you know, sort of to preview things, is that the eugenics movement was fundamentally sort of a scientific movement with an atrocious prior that was off by orders of magnitude and very slow to update. And for the first 40 years of its existence, also a fundamentally incorrect model of how variation worked. And it was this combination of a bad prior with the wrong model that led to some atrocious recommendations. And those atrocious recommendations stayed along for way too long, largely because people were very slow to update priors. So for about, you know, sort of to wrap our heads around where people were in the 1870s with the idea of variation, that every scientist trained before effectively 1860 had the same prior about variation. And that prior was fundamentally Aristotle's. And Aristotle believed organisms had ideal types. There was, for every organism, one creature that was like perfect in every way, that was the ideal type, and it was what nature or God or something had created that was the organism. And everything away from the ideal type, every little bit of variation, everything that you might call noise around that ideal type, was fundamentally considered by Aristotle undesirable and fundamentally considered bad. It is like the error in the individual is variation away from the ideal type. And types themselves were considered immutable. There was an immutable human that was the ideal type. There was an immutable ape that was the ideal type. There was an immutable bird that was the ideal type. And anything that was a hybrid, that we would call modernly a hybridization between types, was literally thought to be a miscreation. It was an abomination. It was something that was against the natural order. It was against what nature or God created. And it was the definition of a monster. And for, sort of in Christian theology, it was often the sign of the devil. So when, sort of in medieval churches, you would often see displays like I'm showing on the right, which has a whole bunch of humans sitting around doing something or another. And there's a creature sort of at the bottom of this picture. And this creature sort of has the head of maybe a chimp, but it has the wings of a bat, and it has like claws like an eagle, and it has feet that look like goats, and it has some kind of tail that I can't make out. This kind of creature that was made of parts of other organisms was literally considered the definition of something that was devilish and wrong. That taking an ideal type and merging two of them together was creating an evil monster. So this was the worldview of anyone who might have been considered trained as a scientist until Darwin comes around. And in many ways, Darwin's most largest and most sort of serious and important contribution to biology is to update the prior on what variation is. And what Darwin does is argue, quite correctly, there is no such thing as a species type. That there are individuals who are more or less like each other, and there is variation around that thing that we might more modernly call a population. And that there is no single type of say, finch in the Galapagos, but there's sort of continuous variation among them. And, sort of Darwin, sort of realizing that variation was not necessarily good or bad, and understanding clearly that the rates of variation could change over time, sort of developed his full-on sort of theory of how organisms change by variation being transmitted from one generation to the next based on sort of differential reproduction. If some variation is associated with some organisms having more kids than others, that variation will tend to spread over time, and variation that is associated with fewer offspring will tend to go away over time. So Darwin, sort of fundamentally and really correctly updated the prior about variation, that variation exists and it is natural. But Darwin truly had nothing to say about the model of inheritance. In fact, Darwin's model of inheritance was fundamentally wrong, and it got him in all sorts of trouble when trying to defend his theory of natural selection. In fact, it was the fact that Darwin knew so little about the model of inheritance that really sort of kept a lot of his ideas from being widely accepted. And the predominant model of inheritance from the 1860s till like the 1910s will be ultimately Galton's model of inheritance. So Galton, you guys know him as well, I'm sure, as any geneticist does, because he is one of the founders of statistical thought in many ways. So Galton had a prior about variation, and Galton's prior about variation was first he adopts Darwin's view that variation is neither good nor bad inherently. that variation just exists. And Galton was probably the first to recognize that if you go and measure things in nature, the measurable variation will almost always form a Gaussian distribution. And Galton was almost surely too the first to have the idea that even things that you can't measure easily are probably Gaussian distributed on some scale you're not observing. So Galton was probably the first to suggest the idea that things like intelligence were normally distributed, even though there was no good way to measure it at the time. He certainly thought things like human worth were normally distributed, even though he doesn't have a good way of measuring it per se. And in Galton's view, so much of nature is Gaussian distributed. We start calling that distribution normal, as you all know. So Galton's prior is all variation is normally distributed, and it is not necessarily good or bad. And Galton's model of inheritance was the predominant model accepted by all serious scientists until the early 20th century. And Galton's model of inheritance is a little bit hard for us as modern people who know some genetics to understand. But the notion was that the variation you see today, the variation you see in this picture of a brother and sister, was created by blending variation in a non-Markovian way over all the ancestors of that individual. So you and I know that genetics more or less is fundamentally Markovian. If you know the state of the parents, you know the state of the offspring, and you don't need to know anything about the grandparents or great-grandparents or great-great-grandparents. And Galton's model was weird, and it was one where there was a blending that goes back, ad infinitum in time, and that the way you got to these individuals was a blended mixture of all their sort of relatives going back in time. And because Galton's model of inheritance is blended, necessarily variation is removed over time. What was a great deal of variance in the past tends to move more and more towards smaller variance, sort of fixed mean smaller variance over time. That's how he thought, inheritance worked. Inheritance fundamentally eliminated variation in Galton's model. But while the model of inheritance he had in mind was just dead wrong, it did successfully predict all sorts of observations. So the reason it was so widely accepted is it allowed Galton to do things like predict children's height as a function of their parents' height. And in fact, it allowed him to predict even distant relatives sometimes as functions of more near relatives. And one of the first things that Galton noticed, and part of what led him to these blended views, was that however much a parent's height differed from the mean, on average, the children's height would differ less from that. It seemed that on average, children returned towards the population mean, away from their parents' sort of more extreme values. And he called, the inheritance of moving sort of more towards the center as a regression towards the mean, a return towards the mean. That's the reason we all use that word now. But he meant it in a pejorative sense. Okay, now we have a historical view of variation that's probably permeating everybody's mind, that it's probably a bad thing, But formally, we don't have to think that anymore. We think that variation is just natural, but we were raised to think it was probably a bad thing. But we know now it's probably just natural. But we think inheritance tends to eliminate variation. So, so we are now eugenicists, and we're going to start thinking about how are we going to make a recommendation to make humans better. And one of the first things we're going to have to think about is we imagine that there are different human populations out there with some amount of variation. And because we believe in this blended inheritance model, what happens if two different populations start to interbreed? So in the sort of classical sense, we sort of think of these sort of Mendelian peas. If a population that was all tall crossed with a population that was all short, that our blended inheritance model would predict that a cross between these two sort of populations would lead to the first generation being sort of all medium height, and then after that, everything else would be all medium forever, because this cross would have lost so much of the variation from the original populations that what you have left are just the medium individuals. It all gets blended away, and over time it becomes more and more and more medium. So that's what we think will happen if we breed two peas together. Now let's apply that notion to what would happen if we breed two populations together with our very, very limited understanding of human variation. So Galton's prior about human populations was that intelligence, capability, worth, any sort of characteristic you would consider about a human that would describe their goodness was more or less Gaussian distributed, was more or less normally distributed. He also believed that almost all European populations had about the same mean for all sort of goodness type traits. And the question is, what did Galton think about non-Europeans? And if you go back to some of his earlier papers, you can see he will literally make some arguments. The first, in order to understand what we're going to read from what he says, we'll read literally his words, is that Galton, because Fisher doesn't really exist, doesn't have a good word for variance, doesn't have a good word for standard deviation. So he starts talking about grades, and grades turn out to be 1/14 of the width of an observed Gaussian distribution with 1 million observations. So a grade is going to turn out to be 2/3 of a standard deviation. It's great to try to read literature that don't know the word variance. So anyway, so Galton's prior about human variation, he makes the following deeply scientific argument. He's going to estimate the difference in population means by, well, talking to white travelers who have been to Africa. What do they think? And you ask them, what do you think, white traveler who have traveled to Africa, about your own intelligence relative to that of the smartest Africans you meet? And Galton replies, the result is familiar enough. The white traveler almost invariably holds his own in their presence. It is seldom that we hear of a white traveler meeting with a black chief whom he feels to be a better man. I've often discussed the topic with competent persons and can only recall a few cases of the inferiority of white men. Certainly not more than might be described to an average actual difference of 3 grades, of which one might be due to the relative demerits of native education, and the remaining 2 to differences in natural gifts. Thus, Galton, because white travelers believe they are at least as bright as any African they meet, Galton concludes that on average, Africans are probably 2 standard deviations below the European mean for sort of intelligence and goodness. But he even recognizes that maybe some of that is environmental, but he subscribes probably, like about 1 1/3 standard deviations to what we would now call genetics. And while this sounds, sort of vaguely scientific, it's an estimate of some sort based on some sort of empirical observation, the underlying data is the opinion of a white traveler about his own intelligence relative to someone he has just met. An alternative interpretation of this data is that, like 95% of white travelers to Africa at this point were inherently racist. So while I might strongly believe well, I know for a fact it is the latter interpretation because we know data now, at the time, these sorts of arguments seemed perfectly plausible and were fundamentally the prior that serious scientists were using. So Galton's worldview, intelligence, ability, worth, they're all normally distributed. The prior is that the mean differences between European and non-European populations are like 2 standard deviations, of which at least like maybe 1 1/3 of them are probably due to underlying genetic differences. And our model of inheritance means that if 2 populations were to blend, the extremes of the distribution will go away, and you will end up somewhere in the average. Therefore, what should you recommend if you believe one population is 2 standard deviations above the other, and that inheritance will cause all that good variation to go away? There are only a couple reasonable recommendations a logical, sensible scientist would make. One of them is to create laws that are called anti-miscongeneration laws, which is again these fake Latin words for misc, meaning mixing, and genus, family. They were laws that banned the mixing of families, or more specifically, there were laws that banned marriage between people of different races. They were intended to keep all the good variation we had in Europe from being blended away by matings between people from non-European populations. And it also meant among people from European populations, we should probably, truncate the distribution at the bad end. We should just keep people who were way below the mean in terms of things we found important from being allowed to breed. Or in other words, what came into being were compulsory sterilization laws for those that were well below the mean. The idea was to truncate the normal distribution and remove those genes from the population. It even gave rise to very legal definitions of words like imbecile that were used to decide who was going to be subject to compulsory sterilization. And this was an attempt, a serious attempt, to make humans better. The goal was to make all of us better, but built on this prior and model of inheritance. I'm going to take a tiny digression into just a few ethical words in like moral system formalism. There are words we throw around regularly in day-to-day conversation that probably have a specific meaning that will matter in this context. They include fascist and liberal. So the term fascism, it's a system of beliefs that argues when society or the state's interests are in conflict with an individual's interests, the state should usually take precedence. In a formal sense, the state's welfare is of higher importance than the individual's welfare. And the definition of liberalism, fundamentally, is a system of beliefs that argue when society and the state's interests are in conflict with the individual's interests, the individual interest should usually take precedence. In a formal sense, the state only exists with the consent of the individuals. And there are people who are at very, very extreme ends of both scales, sort of very, very extreme fascists or very, very extreme liberals, which are often called libertarians. But most of us probably exist somewhere on a continuous scale where we might believe on some questions the state interest should take precedence, and on other questions the individual's interest should take precedence. But the eugenic laws are fundamentally always on the fascist side of the question. They are laws that exist to promote the interests of society or the interests of the state over the interests of a few or many particular individuals of that society. The reason these eugenic laws are sensible is it's the state's desire to improve the mean trait of the population that is considered, if you hold that view as sort of the moral imperative, over whatever effect it is having on the individual that may be sort of harmed by those laws. So if you subscribe to a fascist worldview, eugenics laws are fundamentally moral, particularly if they achieve their goals. And if you subscribe to a liberal worldview, eugenics laws are fundamentally immoral, even if they're successful in changing their goals, because it's sort of the state wins. So, all right, back to genetics. All right, early 1900s, Mendel's 1800s experiments were rediscovered. And in fact, we learned the genetics that all of you in this room know, that while a Galton model predicted that if you blended if you mated a tall and short pea plant, you'd get all medium sized peas plants thereafter for all eternity. In fact, Galton found that that he found a species of pea plants, and he made it, one tall and one short, and the offspring of the first generation were all tall, and the offspring of the next generation were 3/4 tall, 1/4 short. And while you all know that's just the obvious result of a recessive allele for shortness in a single locus. This is sort of single locus, what we call Mendelian genetics nowadays. This observation was fundamentally irreconcilable with Galton's observations about regression, et cetera. And from about 1905, 1901-ish, when Mendelian genetics was first rediscovered, there was all this controversy among biologists, proto-geneticists about what's going on in the world. Because while this observation is entirely incompatible with Galton's model of inheritance, Galton's model of inheritance also is incredibly useful and does great things like predict parent-offspring correlations that this never can. In how it was, the early 20th century was very, very confused. And although very rapidly after Mendel is rediscovered, we do find we introduce notions and words like dominant and recessive, and we start immediately noticing that many human diseases actually are recessive. They require two alleles that are both rare, and only when you have both of them are you likely to get disease. And as a result, in the very early parts of the 20th century, we start seeing a new category of eugenics laws being introduced. And that category of eugenic laws are anti-inbreeding laws. They are laws that make it illegal to marry close relatives in order to avoid sort of recessive disease outcomes. And one of the more sort of, I always find amusing notions here is that Charles Darwin, founder of modern biology, would never have been published ever in his entire life had anti-inbreeding laws existed during his time, because Darwin's wife was also Darwin's first cousin. Turns out they were both actually heirs to the Wedgwood fortune, although Darwin's first cousin was a direct heir and actually inherited a fortune, and Darwin did not. And as a result, Darwin, because his wife was very rich, was himself very rich. And he spent basically 40 years unemployed and writing his books as he enjoyed doing. He never had a real job. He never had any real need for a job. So all that sort of beautiful jasperware bluish pottery that you guys might be familiar with actually funded Darwin's work. So with the introduction of Mendelian genetics, we get a new class of eugenic laws that are anti-inbreeding laws. And now we have this problem of trying to understand how inheritance works. Because clearly there are some traits that are inherited in a Mendelian fashion, but the vast majority of everything you measure that kind of matters out there still seems to follow these Galton kind of models. The unification of Mendelian genetics with Galton's observations was done by Fisher in Fisher's seminal paper in 1918, where Fisher more or less introduces the model of inheritance that is simply the correct one. And not only does he introduce the model of inheritance that is the correct one, he goes on and recapitulates using using Mendelian genetics, but allowing there to be a large number of inheritable factors. He rederives all of these sort of Galton empirical observations quite analytically and fully predicts the correlation between arbitrary relatives as a function of the number and patterns of genes they share. And this was an astonishing accomplishment. It is arguably the greatest paper in population genetics history. And among other immediate outcomes, sort of results of knowing the correct model of inheritance, you can instantaneously show that mixtures have the same underlying genetic variance that the original population had. That mixtures do not eliminate genetic variation per se. They just, sort of redistribute the alleles in some fashion. And if, in fact, it's easy to show that if you create mixture populations and then add selection, you can move population means around as well or better than you could have in any of the individual populations. So, what are the consequences of using the correct model of inheritance? The first immediate consequence of using the correct model of inheritance is there's literally no reason for these anti-miscongeneration laws. None. There is, if you know that mixing does not blend away the underlying variation, there's no more rational basis for those laws. And however, the correct model does show truncation selection works really well. So that if your goal is to move a population mean, truncation selection is a good way of doing it. So if you are trying to make the human population smarter, you can do that by simply murdering all the people at one end of the, my dog is trying to get into this conversation now. You can do it by simply truncating the lowest end of the distribution. And in fact, there's no obvious limit to how well you can sort of select the population and move it over time. So these anti-mixing laws no longer have any rational basis, but laws to limit the ability of those with lower desirable traits, lower levels of some desirable traits, are still justifiable in a scientific way to make the population mean better. So the prior about human variation has updated slowly, very slowly. And by the 1920s, there was ample and overwhelming evidence that there were really no mean differences between children whose parents were from different populations and either of their parents. And so we knew, even by the 20s, there were no deep population differences. There may have been very minor population differences, but we knew there were no real deep population differences. And we knew there was no blending of inheritance here. So the fact that any of these anti-miscongeneration laws existed past the 1920s, you could call a failure to update your prior, or you might simply just have to call it racism. All right, now let's do what might be considered a thought experiment. If you take a moral philosophy on one end of the sort of extreme fascist liberal divide, where nearly all conflict between the state and the individual should be won by the state, sort of an extreme sort of fascist end of the world, and you add to it a wholly incorrect prior that most or nearly all the harms of society are caused by members of populations not historically from your region, and you have a true desire to make your part of the world a better place, the only reasonable sort of outcome of a fascist moral philosophy, a prior that other human populations have worse traits than yours, and a desire to make the world better, is really what happens in Germany from sort of 1933 to 1945. It's really the only natural outcome of these views. And the German experiment from 33 to 45 was really sort of like a lovely application of the eugenic philosophy. And of course, nowadays we simply call that experiment, we tend to call it the Holocaust, or maybe we call it the Shoah or something. And there's a lot of reasons we tend to focus on the number of Jewish individuals the Nazis killed. They culled maybe 6 million of them. But the Nazi program was far beyond one of just attempting to eliminate Jewish populations. It was really a full-on eugenics program where they attempted to eliminate everyone who was intellectually disabled, everybody who was physically disabled, gypsies, which they didn't like for whatever reason, LGBTQ individuals, certain Christian religious dissenters they didn't like, certain Poles they didn't like. And the Nazi eugenic experiment to sort of truncate the distribution along a lot of different axes resulted in something like 11 million people being sort of culled from the human population during these years. So by 1949, it's pretty clear where an extreme eugenic policy can end. When you take it to its extremes, eugenics ends up with the murder of tens of millions of people. So by 49, there was hardly a geneticist on earth that wanted to talk to you about eugenics or attempting to improve the human population, because so many of them were aware of where this goes. And in fact, there was a movement, UNESCO was this United Nations, I can't remember what it fully stands for, scientific committee, something or other. But there was a UN committee formed that was a group of scientists intending to answer the question, can scientists say or do anything to reduce the risk of another genocide? And there were a series of sort of scientific debates and conferences on this in the sort of 40s to 50s. And in the early 1950s, more or less every geneticist on earth had the correct model of inheritance. It's Fisher's, he was right. And the prior about variation that most geneticists had was that most geneticists believed that there were probably mean differences between human populations in terms of anything measurable, and perhaps even in terms of intelligence or ability. But the data that almost all human geneticists knew at the time was that the variance, and now they have very sort of good ways of measuring things like variance, that the variance in any of these traits was extremely large relative to any mean differences. So geneticists, sort of fundamentally believed there could be mean differences between populations, may be proven with large enough data. They knew for a fact the variance was enormous compared to the mean. And the policy conclusion that came out of UNESCO was, because variances are so large compared to mean differences, there's no rational basis for Nazi-like eugenic behavior. And that interpretation is perhaps best expressed by this guy by the name of H.G. Muller. Muller's known by any geneticist currently living in the room. He was one of the original students in the Fly Lab. He wins the Nobel Prize quite early on. He was one of the pioneers of genetic mapping. Stop it. He was sorry guys. He was one of the pioneers of genetic mapping, and he was the discoverer of de novo mutations. Come on. Sorry. Anyway, so Muller's sort of summary of the sort of predominant view at the time was that that even though it's possible there are mean differences between populations, he writes, it would be a tragic mistake to suppose that the above realistic scientific view leads to the conclusion that race prejudices are justified. It is highly important, especially at this crisis in the relations between people, for the committee to give the correct argument against these prejudices. The essential points are that the different racial groups are A, enough alike genetically, and B, are capable of being so much influenced in mental development by cultural and other environmental factors, and C, contain such important individual genetic differences for psychological traits within each one of them, that all of them are capable of participating and cooperating fruitfully in modern civilization, as has been empirically demonstrated. It also follows that from this, all men should be given equal opportunities, equal civil rights, and the privilege of being judged and treated entirely as individuals without reference to their racial origin. In other words, there is so much variation that whatever mean differences they are, they're swamped out, and we shouldn't make policy that disenfranchises or disadvantages huge groups because of tiny means relative to the variance. So where was R.A. Fisher in all of this? So from the 1920s onward, he was the chair of the Department of Eugenics at University College London. He was editor-in-chief of the Annals of Eugenics that he's written a lot of papers that might reasonably be considered eugenic. All of this sort of started in the 20s and 30s. But from my perspective, I honestly don't really care because so much of the field was eugenical during that period. They were fundamentally caught up in bad priors. To me, the questions that to ask about Fisher are, how did his beliefs change after 1945, when the logical fulfillment of the eugenic agenda was clear? Once we knew we're taking eugenics to the extreme might lead, how did Fisher respond? And one of the ways Fisher responded was by being one of the only geneticists on Earth not to sign or otherwise endorse Muller's interpretation of the UNESCO Accords. He was literally one of the only geneticists who said, no, I do not agree that the amount of variation being so much larger than the means we shouldn't be prejudiced. That was a very unusual viewpoint to be held in the sort of 1949. And he certainly never endorsed stronger statements than Muller's. And another sort of key question, sort of key little observation was about this German, sort of human geneticist by the name of von Verscha. He studied largely what I would now call heritability experiments in humans rather decently before the war. But during the war, he became one of the sort of chief geneticists in the Nazi Party. And Germany, after the war, most of the universities tended to more or less fire people with strong Nazi connections during the war. And von Verscher was attempting to get his university position reinstated and sought letters from other prominent geneticists around the world. And Fisher's letter in support of von Verscher's reinstatement at university reads in part, this is von Verscher, Fisher writing, as he has been attacked for sympathy towards the Nazis, I, Fisher, may say that his reputation stood exceedingly high among human geneticists before we'd even heard of Adolf Hitler. It was, I think, his misfortune rather than his fault that racial theory was a part of the Nazi ideology. And it was therefore of some propaganda importance to the Nazi movement to show that the party supported the work of unquestioned value, such as that which von Verscher was doing. In spite of their prejudices, I have no doubt also that the party sincerely wished to benefit German racial stock, that the party truly was eugenic and had good intentions, especially by the elimination of manifest defects, such as those of deficient mentality. And I do not doubt that von Verscher gave, as I should have done, his support to such a movement. In other respects, however, I imagine his influence was consistently on the side of scientific sanity in drafting the administration of laws intended to this end. So,
Dave, I just wanted to give you a 2-minute warning. I do want to leave some time for question and answer. So
I'm just about done here.
Sure.
So in 1947, Fisher knew that eugenics could lead, where eugenics could lead. He still doesn't sign Muller's interpretation of UNESCO. And in defending his friends, he suggests that culling intellectually disabled, now that's fine. The Jewish stuff's maybe too much, but simply culling those that were mentally disabled, he sees as a perfectly reasonable thing to have done. Fisher didn't have a lot of respect for those that were not like himself. And this lack of respect in the eugenics was actually part and parcel of things almost all of us who know anything about Fisher know he also regularly used to get in these insane fights. He was in that bitter personal stuff with Pearson that started almost surely with Fisher in 1918 in Pearson's attempt to suppress it. But, he was also in that blood feud with Neumann, right? I mean, it's hardly even understandable to me, what they're fighting about. Misparticipation of priors is bad, data should, we all know this stuff, but why it became so bitter and personal? In the genetic side, Fisher was that same way with Sewell Wright and Wright and Haldane. We got these crazy fights that went on forever about what population structure maximized the rate of evolution and what is the basis of dominance. These fights that went on, they were bitter, personal ad hominem for dozens of years. And it just sort of suggests that Fisher probably didn't have a lot of use for people who weren't himself. And he really didn't like to update his priors very much. That said, he was the greatest population geneticist who ever lived. I mean, there's really no question about it. His genetical theory book established my field. You guys all know he coined variance, he coined ANOVA, created likelihood, made the whole maximum likelihood framework stuff. It's, it may be possible to be arguably the greatest scientist of all time, certainly one of them, and be kind of an awful man. And Fisher probably was both. So today we know eugenics laws actually still exist today in many places because a lot of the US doesn't eliminate laws even after they stop enforcing them. Inbreeding laws are there's a good basis for them in the sense of society is benefited by the existence of anti-inbreeding laws, that inbreeding is bad for the human population. They are fundamentally fascist on the fascist liberal scale because you're preventing people from marrying who they want, but they do make society better. And of course, what is the prior for human variation? Most of us all know that you've got a genome with 3 billion bases. of which 99.9% are identical to every other human on Earth. Of the bases that vary, 80 to 90% of that variation is common to all humans, which is what we might call residual variance. Of the human variation that sort of separates people by where their ancestors came from, about 5 to 10% of human variation reflects what part of a continent you came from, and about 5 to 10% of the human variation reflects what continent your ancestors came from. So there is almost no variation anywhere in the genome, and to the extent that there is variation, about 80% of it's residual, 5 to 10% is where in the continent you came from, and 5 to 10% is where your ancestors came from. That's the right prior for human variation, if you just want to know it. And almost all of this talk is actually Will Provine's work. Will Provine was well, he's dead now, was the sort of historian of population genetics. And I've done nothing more than summarize a few of Will's papers.
Thank you, David. This was a wonderful talk.
Sorry, I went over everything bad.
No, that's okay. That's okay. So people, if you have questions, you can type on the chat and I can read it. So while you are doing it, I'm going to ask my first question to David. Fisher was a very complicated personality, and no wonder that I think he contributed so much to the field of statistics and genetics. And I was wondering, he was also a big thing on the agricultural experiments. He was always mixing varieties and doing experiments on those. And also he was a big on animal husbandry. So he was very big on mixing the, different breeds and different ways of breeding and so on and so forth. To what extent that viewpoint of improving the yield, whether you're talking about the agricultural yield or the animal production yield, that really was so fixed in him that he thought that the same knowledge could be adapted to improving the humanity or improving the human populations. That's
exactly it. That is exactly it. That truncation selection works in animals. It would work in humans at moving the mean of something. If you successfully find the one end of the normal, you can change the normal's mean. He's right.
Yeah. So he did not have that different kind of a moral complexions that he's not dealing with the animals here. It's not dealing with the agricultural products here. So
yeah, I think he doesn't. I don't think he cares about the end of the distribution that he recommends culling. I don't think it matters to him what happens there. And and he's right, I can move the mean. I'm a liberal. It matters to me what happens to everyone. But if you are a sufficient fascist.
Yeah, okay. So I have a questions on the chat. Let me read that. How would you put genome editing techniques in the light of this history?
I very much view these sort of questions very much on the moral philosophy question, on the if it is liberal in the sense of it is a human choosing to do it to themselves. I honestly don't care. On the other hand, if it is the state deciding what has to be done to a member of the state, then I'm adamantly opposed to it. So I would be opposed to any law that required editing of something to someone against their will. But I would not be opposed necessarily to people being allowed to change some things in their offspring or themselves.
Second question. how do we document or describe the change in ideas and attitudes that happened between 1942 and 1952?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know to what extent people understood what was going on in Germany before 1945, but certainly after 1945 into the 50s, people came to fully understand what happened there. And in my view, if you were to ignore what happened there, well, it happened. And it's difficult for me to accept any philosophical argument that has as its natural conclusion Germany 1944. If you pretend that, you can't pretend that didn't happen, at least in there was hardly any scientists in the 50s that wanted to go anywhere near an argument that taken to its extreme ends up in Nazi Germany. And the whole world knew, everyone knew. There was, I mean, maybe if you were sufficiently isolated, you didn't, but the vast majority of people did.
Any, let me see where it is in here. Yeah, those are the questions I have, and from the chat. And I want to thank you for giving this fantastic talk, and hopefully, I think the lessons that we have learned are used in our own diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives, because I think many of those things have been institutionalized, and I think we have to really think about how to really remove those institutionalized structures in our own society, even today, even to this day.
Yeah, policy, I mean, some of these laws still exist in some states because state legislature, they stopped enforcing them, but they didn't take them away. And many of the policies from this era in the early 20th century are still, I mean, 4-H clubs came out of a lot of this stuff. Like these ideas permeated society and have not fully gone away. Maybe because we don't update priors. Maybe we're all a little racist, you know, it's, call it what you will. But what may have been logical, well-intended views in the 19th century still lead to policy choices today. I think that's clear.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dave and Raghu. I know that there are some other questions that for internal discussion that we want to respond to, but thank you for sharing this chronicle, because without knowing the history and the past, we cannot really move forward. So thank you so much for sharing your time and your thoughts this afternoon. Thanks, Raghu, as well.
Sorry about my dog. Bye-bye.
No problem. So, we are all used to it. So thank you so much. Now it's time for Mike Elliott and Dave Kubacki to take it away and respond to your submitted questions, as well as some of the policies and procedures of coming back, and also they have some poll everywhere. So over to Dave and Mike.
Okay. Dave, do you want to kick off sharing?
Yep, I can kick off sharing.
Okay.
Hold on one second here. All right. So I'm going to just run through a few slides regarding what we know so far from what we've heard for fall planning. And then we're going to go through some poll everywhere questions and then that Mike has. And then we're going to also talk about look at some pre-submitted questions that we also had. So what do we know so far about fall planning? So we've seen a framework from President Schlissel that there'll be mostly in-person classes. Some of our larger classes will be done remotely. And I'll say a little bit about this more throughout. We know that there will need to be obviously staff and faculty and services to support what an in-person fall semester looks like. So that is kind of essentially what we heard from President Schlissel in early March. Last week there was a town hall for SPH, and they went through, and I'm not going to read each of these again because I want to make sure we have time to get to questions, but they outlined some guiding principles. And basically, you know, as we've kind of done all along, we're going to look toward the state, the CDC, and the university for guidance in how we approach the semester and any changes that happen during the semester. You know, we're gonna, as we have done, prioritize the health and safety and well-being of the members of our community. I don't think we've, you know, rushed back to campus anytime recently. So I would imagine that'll, you know, still be our approach. While we'll be on campus, we'll be certainly monitoring any changes in the pandemic, and we'll respond accordingly. The other hope is that we will, during this time period between now and when we start the semester, obviously we want to reach out to stakeholders, get feedback, and then obviously communicate that information as we get it in. So we did hear a little bit about modes of instruction. Like I said earlier, we do anticipate that most classes will be in person, with larger classes to be done virtually or online. So what is a large class? Well, as you can expect, we're kind of still working out exactly what that means. So one of the things that we're looking at is kind of that the registrar is looking at our classes, projected enrollment, and then figuring out you know, which could fit into those in-person spaces, you know, both at a 3-foot distance from each other and 6 foot of spacing. So obviously there's still more to be learned from that. There will be some opportunities for engagement from the community. So I just want to mention these few things. You probably have already seen requests for a fall planning committee. I believe those requests for participation are closed. But there will be additional staff focus groups over the next few weeks. So if staff are interested in participating in fall planning and you know, future remote hybrid work schedules or flex schedules, I would encourage everyone to participate that is able to participate in those sessions, because I think it's important to have your voice heard. At any time you can submit questions or your thoughts through the Heights. So there is a on the COVID planning page, which is one of the main tabs on the Heights. There's a form to submit questions. There's a link in the second paragraph. So this is just another example of an opportunity to get your voices heard. So this is specifically related to working from home. So there has been there was a quick recap of what the policy for continued remote work from home or outside of what a supervisor policy might have. I think that the school, and we'll talk again a little bit more about this in subsequent slides, but there will be a school-wide approach and guidelines. I think of them more as recommendations. The chairs and administrators, the department administrators, such as myself, will be working with the school to kind of develop, I think, a framework and recommendations for potential continued remote work options for staff. we want to be supportive of options to telecommute, but obviously some of that is going to depend on the type of work you're doing and what your supervisor sets as those parameters. Obviously, being that we're going to have in-person components, we want to make sure that we are here for students and here for faculty, and providing a level of service that would be adequate for that. So just quickly, what I take away from all of this is in terms of staff, is there's really a lot of work to still be done. So I know that we've been saying this for, I feel like, a while, where we're, I think, still waiting for some, to solidify some sort of framework and, get that out to people so that way we can talk about it and everyone has an opportunity to participate. But there's still a lot of planning to be done. I think once we have, and I think through our conversations with chairs and department administrators, I think we're getting close to some recommendations. So I think you can expect those recommendations to be given soon. And then that will be, those will be good topics and starting places for when we do have focus groups to help with the fall planning process. I think staff should also expect to have conversations with your supervisors regarding your schedule. So I think U of M has always been sort of decentralized. So I could see, again, a lot of recommendations and a framework for what we think might work. But, your supervisors and units and research centers, may have a specific idea that they anticipate for remote or flex work environment. So a lot of those decisions, specific decisions, may be made at that level. And the last thing I'll say is, and I know that this is, I feel like something I say all the time is, this just is going to take some time. So, we've been working remotely for a year, and, we've obviously learned that we can do many of the things that we did previously remote, but we don't know how that's going to look once we have a mixture of students and faculty in the building more often. And, we just have to make sure that we can deliver at a high quality for those constituents. So I think, again, as much as we can be patient and realize that it's going to take some time to get to some of the specifics and details of this, that's what we'll do our best. So I'm going to hand it over to Mike to talk a little bit specifically about what does this mean for students. And Mike, if you want to go ahead.
Sure. Thanks very much, David. So clearly a lot of what you said is relevant for all of us, faculty, students, and staff, but I'm just going to dive a little deeper into some of the specific student issues. So, and I'll maybe start at the bottom in the sense of pointing out that everything I say here is basically a best guess at this point, and is obviously going to be contingent on how things evolve as the summer and fall transpire. So clearly the long-term goal is to return to what I'm calling a pre-pandemic plus state. The plus meaning that we try to retain good things we learned about doing during the pandemic, but in many ways are returning to our standard residential format. So specifically right now, that means that most, if not all, of the classes for our biostat students are going to be residential without a hybrid option. So similarly, most and all GSI positions will likely require a residency in Ann Arbor. So there's definitely going to be an issue for international students who had to start the program without being able to obtain a visa or a flight, in particular our students from China, but potentially other places as well. So for folks in that situation, we're going to be doing our best to find workarounds. One thought is, recording courses and try to make sure office hours and exams are available at times convenient to you. But certainly suggestions for how we can help are going to be welcome here. Again, so all this is contingent on vaccines, bringing COVID-related illnesses back to a manageable level. If there are problems with the distribution, if there are variants that pop up that are not stopped by the vaccines, then plans may change. So So we're going to go on and do a little poll everywhere. Maybe just take a minute, Dave, and see if there are questions. Type into the chat or.
So there is a question about undergraduate students, that how does the return of the undergraduate students affect SPH and in general biostatistics? So I think that if I'm not incorrect, so I think there are 80 to 90 undergraduate students, Tom, that are public health majors. We do not directly admit them. Liberal arts admits them, but we get them.
Yeah, it's about twice that. It's about 180.
Okay.
I don't think that has any effect. I mean, undergraduates and graduates are probably going to be treated pretty similarly, at least starting this fall. So.
Yeah, and we do not have a biostatistics major,
right.
So
none of those folks are actually enrolled in biostatistics per se. Any other questions? Okay, Dave, I think we're gonna run a little poll everywhere, kind of wake everybody up a little bit, and probably also maybe even give us a bit of helpful information. So we're gonna try to do this. My first time trying to do this, so I'm hoping it's gonna work from your end, David. If not, I can take over on this side, or even just work directly on the Poll Everywhere site. So you may be patient with us a little bit. It should come up with those details, but just in case not, maybe just give a second. You could jot those down or type those in somewhere.
Can you paste the link in the chat?
Sure.
Oops.
Oh, great. So either one of those, cell phone or computer version. Okay, why don't we move on and see how this works? So I don't think it's going to work right now, Dave, the way it's running there. It might need to come up on my end, because you should have the full. All
right, Mike, do you want to try sharing your screen then?
Yeah, let me see if I can get this to work. Yeah, I think it's going to work here. All right. Can you? You have to release your screen. I think maybe not. Oh, it's taken over, I guess. Well, now I'm in the dark. So, okay, people vote on this.
So, Mike, we cannot see your screen. Is that?
It's okay. It's up on my. Yeah. Okay. I don't know what happened there. I'll try it again. Can you see it now?
Yep. There we go.
Okay. And hopefully that'll work. Okay. So it looks like it's about 2 to 1. Maybe some folks are on the fence. I didn't give a don't know option. Okay, so clearly, there's a large minority of folks that are concerned about this. So let's go. I'll move on to the next slide. I think we can hopefully get folks to type in specific concerns. So we'll get the usual word cloud here. You can see, obviously, this is going to help us try to figure out what are some things we might be able to do to help. Yes, clearly being vaccinated, critical. I guess I didn't word cloud this, but it should be saved. Right. So clearly concerns that even if you about getting vaccines for yourself, I'm again hopeful that certainly by next September, at least in the U.S. and uh, um, the vaccination, everyone will have had an opportunity to get vaccinated. Of course, that if you get vaccinated doesn't mean you can guarantee other people are vaccinated, and I think that's a valid question. You know, we've heard talk about vaccine passports, but I don't see anywhere anyone has done that, at least in the States. So, okay. Right. And I should mention, I think the idea of having some separation in the classroom is going to be maintained, because very large classes right now are planning to be not happening. They're going to be done remotely. Right. So variants, all those things are important. Okay. All right. So I guess the next question we're going to ask here is basically your plans to return to Ann Arbor. If you're not taking classes, you really, it's, I guess, somewhat of an open issue. I think we're going to probably be encouraging it, but and if you are going to be in classes, you're probably going to have to at least be considering that if possible. But if you're not taking classes, it's a little less critical. So I think we just wanted to get a flavor on whether people wanted to come back, if they're in that category. I know some of you must be. Well, maybe none of you are on the town hall, but. Again, I think this is an open issue. We can discuss it, figure it out, what works for people, but sort of getting a sense of where you would like to be would be helpful.
Yeah, scanning the participant list, Mike, I'm not sure there are very many people who are relevant to this question.
Then we'll skip it. Oops. Okay. All right. Looks like we did get a few votes at the last second here. So now this question actually is really relevant to everyone, right? There's this, we've been out for a long time now. And if we are going to be transitioning back to in-person learning at work, what are some of the things that the department can do to help with this? I mean, implicit are some of the things that were mentioned before, but okay. So small group retreats. Allowing for more remote work. Right, some good basics. Yeah. I think the last one is probably not going to be possible, but hybrid schedules. So, all right, so clearly seeing some demand for continuing to allow for remote work where possible. I think that's going to be a good link to the next question. So what are some things we started doing during the pandemic you'd like to see continuing after it ends? So I'm going to be predicting that more remote work will be one of those options. But there may be some other thoughts as well. Okay, so we're pushing 4 o'clock, and I'm trying not to run this over too much, so I'll probably go ahead and let this go. But you're welcome to email me with some responses to this if you haven't gotten on the poll everywhere comments. So, right. Okay. So I guess realizations and lessons from this year. Okay. All right. So we now have a submitted question and answer session. So I don't know. I guess I can just sort of continue in process here. So first question, I think I've already partly answered this. Will the classes be completely in person or mixed in fall 2021? Currently, there is a plan for classes to be in person unless they're very large. And I think the cutoff for that is likely to be larger than any of our actual biostat student classes. So it's possible some of our 500 level classes we offer to the school will be in that round. There's an outside chance, I suppose, 601 and 602 could be large enough to be remote or hybrid, but probably the smaller classes are not going to be. Again, all contingent on things kind of moving the direction that we're hoping them to. Next question, are we required to wear a mask in class or anytime on campus? I think the response to this is we're going to follow the rules on this. Currently, right now, certainly if you're on campus, you need to have a mask on. That rule may still be around next fall. And if not, then I think we're probably going to have to default to whatever the university position is on that. I think we're all probably wearing masks a lot more. We'll be adopting more of what at least a decade or two beforehand was more common, I think, in East Asia. But I think the basically for many of the things here, it's hard for us to set our rules at the department level for these broader questions, and I'll be following the same way. And David, please jump in if you anything else you want me to add.
Nope, I think that's what I would have said too, Mike.
Yeah. Okay. And for students with offices on the second floor, what will the department do to improve the ventilation system? And here, I think I'm going to hand these last ones back to David because you have some specifics on this.
Yes. So thanks, Mike, and thanks for the submitted questions. Just so you guys know, prior to the start of classes in 2020, there was a cross-campus task force that looked at making sure that our ventilation was within CDC guidelines. So I can say, and I'm not sure if many of you have been in the building since fall, but air exchanges were increased to their full capacity, which I hear it in some spaces represented a 50% increase. So the ventilation issues should likely be substantially better. So if once we are back in the building more consistently, obviously if you notice continued issues, I unfortunately haven't been in the building too much since I only started in May, but if you do run into these issues as a student or staff, please let me know, and I can follow up with facilities as I'm able to. Mike, if you want to head to the next slide. So here we have a question: in case of secondary outbreak, what emergency plan will you take? And I'll answer this as well. So, I think it's going to be similar to what we've seen previously. So, we're going to work obviously with the university and follow their guidelines. One of the specific SPH guiding principles is to remain agile and anticipate changes. We know that guidance may change over time. I think on the bright side of things, obviously in 2020, we had to pivot quickly to a remote offering. So at least I think in this case, if we had a secondary outbreak, we certainly, I think, have the experience to do so quickly. Hopefully that won't be the case, but we will certainly follow the state's recommendations, SPH recommendations, and act accordingly. Mike, yep, thanks. I think this might be our last pre-submitted questions, then we can certainly open it up to see if there are additional questions. So we had a question here. What is the status of the Department Climate Survey from 2020? What are the results? So just wanted to let you know I did follow up with...
I can respond to that.
Oh, okay, great.
Okay. So just to give you a little bit of background, we hired an outside analyst, in order to maintain the privacy and confidentiality, that none of the committee members wanted to have the data set available, but we hired an outside consultant or outside analyst to analyze the data. We went back and forth in terms of presentation of the results. We want to make sure that our presentation also follows the same principle that we don't accidentally disclose or identify any one particular respondent. And that went back and forth, and I think it was much harder than we thought, that remotely doing the analysis, not having the data, will be this difficult. So we finally found a way to present the results. So we have got the preliminary results. So we are developing a presentation for the department. I think most likely we'll be doing that maybe towards the end of April. And then we will do some regression analysis as well after that. So that's the plan.
Thank you, Raghu. So I just want to add a comment. The last comment is about like how fall is going to look like, and the university has several models for assuming. So right now they're operating under the model that almost all faculty and staff are vaccinated, and about 25 to 50% of students are vaccinated. But I think that all the high alert guards about symptom tracking, filling out responsibly, contact tracing, seeing one case and chasing it down, they are all going to remain in place for the foreseeable future, because even if with 70–80% vaccinated, in the history of infectious diseases, you do see outbreaks, as you asked, like emergency outbreaks. So all the guards will be in place. And so though we are thinking about the returning to normalcy post-vaccination, it's not going to change overnight. So I just want to be realistic in terms of our expectations. But fall is viewed as a transitional semester because we have gone through this process. But then from winter onwards, I am in the COVID Faculty Council planning and talking with President Schlissel and Provost Collins every other week. And then the thought is that we are an in-person residential institution, and with some flexibilities, we are going to recapture that environment of being back in person. So that's what the sentiment is. Happy to take any other questions. And we are at the clock, but really happy to address any other questions anyone may have. You can unmute yourself, or you can place it in the chat.
Bharmar, you said that it's a transitional semester.
Yes.
I'm wondering about sort of not last minute changes, but changes as time progresses. If, for instance, a faculty member is just not able to teach in person, would that become a hybrid course? Is that a possibility? I know that some of the room assignments may change as time progresses according to the distancing rules, and that it sounds like the registrar is trying to make those updates as quickly as possible. But I'm wondering how many other moving parts are there?
Yeah, so too many moving parts. I think I want to do a cohort study of how it was to be an administrator during the time of COVID and what that does to your life, right? Because every day across like the policy and everything changes because the number of cases and everything changes. So couple of things we know. So what are some guiding principles? There will be students who will be caught in terms of immigration requirements, right? We do not want to stop them from attending. So I really want to emphasize that. And so that will mean that, yes, we may not, we go make into a classroom, we give our lectures, and we may not be like, in tune with regular synchronous teaching, but all the videotaped lectures and the material will be accessible so that students can learn and can also join office hours, right? So this is a middle ground. There are some pre-existing conditions and other things which may make transition for a particular faculty transition difficult. So if a class of small size has to be taught in a virtual way or in a hybrid way due to special circumstances, I think the school is going to ask for those accommodation requests, which has been in the past, and they will have another policy because people have other reasons. And so I think they will first determine how large is large, and after that send out any special requests and needs that need to be accommodated so that there is a fluent transition. So that's what I know. So some of the guiding pillars I know, I do not know the micro level details.
Thank you. That's helpful.
So will our classes be sent away from the School of Public Health? Because the number of large classrooms in public health is uncomfortably small, actually.
Yes. So I think that they are trying to be very creative in terms of the schedule, Mike, in terms of the timing as well, and also think about just maybe there will be more classes on Friday. We'll not have many choices. So they are really thinking this is a complicated thing. And even the 3 feet and 6 feet became a big issue for us because with 3 feet, we could have some classes. And so all of these guidelines, and if there is a spike in Michigan, and again, people say 6 feet, things are going to change. And so I think we have to be really prepared for doing online and prepared for this hybrid reality until we figure this all out. Mm-hmm.
So how is the fall calendar looks like at this moment? The student will not return to campus after Thanksgiving, as what was last year.
Well, I do not know about that. There has not been a change. Like last year, there was a 2-month holiday, right? The students went back in, before Thanksgiving and came back in, and then in the winter semester is delayed. Nicole, do you know what the calendar is looking like? I have not checked that.
I'll look. I'm not sure. I thought that it was resuming to previous years, but let me check.
I think at this point we would assume it's the same as previous as it's always been. But again, probably guidance will.
Yeah. So I just think that this time has taught us that we are very good at modeling uncertainty in our models, right? Incorporating, and we like jazz about it. But then when it comes to our lives and our schedules, I think it is unnerving and we are all figuring out, but we are also getting very adaptive to it and trying to do the best as we can. But I think that there will be this semester, we sort of will be really prepared for very flexible, adaptive, resilient type of semester, and that transitions us to a more normal winter, like a pre-pandemic plus.
So Bramar, this notion that classes, it sounds like might be at different times than in times past, that's really important to get around to people, because I suspect that people, at least I hadn't heard that. It makes total good sense, of course, but I don't know if people have generally heard that.
No, I think that, of course, all of these ideas come up in conversation, and until anything is finalized, nobody wants to release any kind of messages. And again, if it looks like everybody is vaccinated, things are looking very good and normal, and then it would be a completely different story. So that's why I think people are hesitant to make any official announcements right now. But it's also a very big puzzle, right? Because if one person changing a class will change everything. So everything has to be thought together. But this was an idea that came up, that how do you accommodate? Of course, going to nearby buildings is one solution, but this was also another suggestion that came up.
And it makes total good sense. I'm just wondering, there are some things you don't want to trouble people with ahead of time. And there are some things you need to trouble people with ahead of time, because if there's the possibility that that might happen, then people might have made plans for all sorts of different things, assuming they would be taking classes at particular times, teaching at particular times. So if that's actually actively under discussion, it's probably good for people to know that as a possibility.
Mm-hmm. But again, like, in deans and chairs, people actually discuss a lot of ideas, but I know that Ellen is actively working on figuring out if we can accommodate sort of the baseline schedule, and maybe there are 1 or 2 or 3 things which need adjustment. So she's operating under that assumption. Yeah. Not too many changes, but there may be 3 or 4 or 5 things which are really hard, and then just focus on the X beta part and figure out the epsilon. So
but it's also, I think sometimes people don't want to release it, because if they release it and then change it, that creates even more animosity than not releasing it. So variance is very high. So we can't just, everybody's in the same boat. So we all have to ride the waves.
Yeah. And I have heard from many students who showed up in my share with the chair that they really are feeling, particularly first year students who are going on to second year, they're afraid that they are going to graduate from the program without ever knowing their classmates or their faculty.
Yeah.
So they are anxious to see even some of us in small groups, because that would really be very incomplete experience as a graduate student if you don't know your classmates, if you don't know your professors.
Bramar, like you said, there are so many unknowns, and I-20s are another unknown. And I'm wondering, I don't think that the registrar has a plan to ask students whether they plan to attend in person or view recordings, or, if they're here in the United States even. But that might help with our classroom size issue. And that way then we might know more about how many to actually expect in the classroom.
Yes.
So.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But at the same time, like, these are competing goals, right? We really want to encourage students who can attend to come back to classroom. And then we are saying that if there were some more staying at home, we could manage the classroom. So we really have to think about this whole spectrum, how we can accommodate people. Yeah.
But isn't it safe to say that we have to plan for a hybrid?
I think for a fall, I think that would be the natural thing, that, I think going back to teach in person for maybe 15, 16, 17, 18 student classes, probably they will be in person, but there will be 1 or 2 students who will probably not come up. And for them, I think we should think about, if not direct broadcasting or live streaming, but having all the videos, all the material, having an office hour so that they can interact, all of these arrangements.
Yeah, I think hybrid in the sense that the dean's office was referred to it last year may not be the model, but hybrid in the sense of making sure that, assuming that there are going to be some students who can't be in the class, and that we need to do whatever we can. And some of that may really be making it hybrid in the formal sense, or maybe just trying to make sure there are recordings and ways to be in touch.
And many faculty have shared with me that that was the most difficult part, being in a classroom, managing the class, the Zoom, the whiteboard, and where the camera is capturing. It was much easier for them to do either full in person or 2 ends of the spectrum, instead of being in the middle and not being able to cater to any of the audience. So that's a common sentiment that have been shared.
Right. I also can imagine if you have a class where virtually everybody's not able to be in the US, then you're just going to do it remotely, right?
Yes.
So,
yes. So I think if you're teaching in person, videotaping your lectures and then putting that up, and so that people can do asynchronous learning, is probably the most optimal way if you cannot manage all of those components simultaneously and both groups suffer. So, yeah. Any other questions?
I imagine that there will be some competition of the classroom space because they require the social distance in the classroom. Is there any sort of possibility to teach in the evenings in order to sort of arrange more classes in big rooms or something like that?
That's exactly what Mike was talking about, right? That if there are such changes in schedule, then students should know, faculty should know. If we are spreading the classes through a longer time span, then people should know, because other things are all in coordination. So right now, the effort is to really keep that structure and then figure out some of the exceptional, not make that as a rule, but I don't know, things may change. Yeah, because the whole universities thing is like a big, Jenga puzzle, right? So you take one block off and the whole thing's collapse. So you really have to think about that.
Yeah, also not every classroom has this recording capacity to record lectures. I suppose that if you want to record your lectures, how are you going to do it real time? You have to have the facility that allows you to do that, right?
No, the Zoom recording, I think, works pretty much in every classroom right now, because you just click. Zoom is integrated, so if you that can work.
Oh, okay.
Panopto does work, and so those work. But there are some things which captures the whole classroom, like the OWL camera, so that you can get more real feeling of where your classmates are sitting, what is being written on the whiteboard. That is limited in SPH. Only 2 or 3 rooms have that.
Yeah, I think I better figure out, because you are using PowerPoint and you project your slides on the screen in the classroom. Same time, that slide should be on your Zoom as well. But this is technical detail. I think that somehow we need to figure out anyway.
But you can use Panopto as well. So we can talk. We can definitely figure that out, and staff are going to work to make sure. And SPH last year actually had somebody present in each of the classrooms in the first few days to show people how to make things work. But sometimes that just did not work well, because the iPad and the Zoom and everything, and Mike, I think, will attest to that it did not work very well.
Mike had some good experience, bad experience last year. Yeah.
Okay. Anything else? Anything else? All right. That was an interesting chronicle of the movement of prior about human variation, starting from Aristotle, coming to Fisher, and concluded with Fisher is a great scientist, but a nasty man. I never thought that I'd see that written in a slide. And I think, but what did you think, Mike, in terms of the chronicle? I actually, this was pretty new to me, this sort of movement.
I'd never seen it structured exactly that way. Certainly the conclusions about Fisher are without doubt correct. That's really never been in doubt, I guess. But I thought he did a nice job of putting it together, actually.
Yeah, I thought that when I heard actually in JSM, and I have listened to many talks like this, but the progression of how thinking changed, and it was really incorrect prior with an incorrect model, which led to atrocious judgments and policy. I really felt that theme flew quite well. Yeah.
Actually, I think Tukey once told me about what happened when he asked a question to Fisher when he came. And Tukey asked about some question about the fiducial inference. Fisher got so angry that he asked him to leave the place that they were together, and even though it was raining and Tukey didn't have an umbrella, that he had to walk in the rain. So this was
no,
I don't think that's particularly high on the list of Fisher's sins.
I think he was a very bitter man, right? He was in fighting with everybody. So
no, I think the way he insulted him and then summarily asked him to leave like that. So it was just funny to hear a story like that from a one legend to about the another legend.
Yeah. So okay.
But there were things early in Fisher's career that were really unfortunate. I mean, the whole thing with the 1918 paper, which whether you whether you view it as the greatest paper in population genetics history or not, I do. It's a very difficult to read paper, but it appeared in a very minor journal because Pearson blackballed it. So
Yeah.
Yeah. So
and
I
you could argue it not only defined genetic inheritance, but also the analysis of variance. Neither one of those
Exactly.
accomplishments is too minor.
Yeah,
So,
and Carl Pearson was very nasty too. So, and then that dispute between Fisher and Carl Pearson about the degrees of freedom for chi-square is how nasty they were. But of course, Pearson was wrong. But the way I think he presented that, although he's right, I think Fisher was mindless, you know. But Fisher was proved to be right.
But you know, like I think that Mike says that one thing Mike says that life is too short to work with bad people. I think I would be, even if Fisher was the greatest, that I think it's not worth putting up with his attitude and arrogance. Of course, his statistics is brilliant. Yeah.
I think I'd have to make an exception for that one, at least in terms of interacting with someone who is that incredibly transcendently brilliant.
Yeah.
I'd want to keep myself out of his power, but gosh,
yeah,
incredible talent.
Yeah, yeah, so it's phenomenal. Yeah. All right, so I have to go. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
It was wonderful to see. Have a good weekend.